Good afternoon. Thanks for accommodating us in this office. We're just over with some employees from the Department of Natural Resources. They're using our conference room for an award session today. I wanted to pass on our appreciation and congratulations to the award winners and appreciations to our employees in all state agencies, but in this case particularly the DNR. So I appreciate the opportunity to share with you here today. For us, this is part of a great week, and as I've often have pointed out plenty of times before, a lot of this evolves around what we've talked about, Wisconsin being open for business, and it's important to stress that, because not only today's numbers I'm going to touch on in just a moment, but overall, in the past week's time, we've had a series of very good and positive announcements. Certainly leading into that, we've been talking about the fact that for the first 3 months of this year, in January, February, and March, we've seen here in Wisconsin the private sector has created more than 24,000 new jobs, more than 11,000 of those jobs being in manufacturing. New numbers for April will come out later next week, and we anticipate that we'll see an additional trend of continuing down that path. So for us, we already set the table for positive news when it comes to jobs. But really, in the last few days, on Friday, Chief Executive Magazine did their annual survey of 500 CEOs from across the country. In the past, most of us haven't talked a whole lot about that here in the state of Wisconsin because we were usually hovering somewhere between 40 and 50. A year ago, we were at 41. As of Friday's announcement in their magazine, we had moved up 17 slots, the fastest improvement of any state in the country in this survey, and in the history of the survey, the fastest growth in any one given year of any state in the entire country. So for us, that was good news because that affirms all that we've said about being Wisconsin open for business starting all the way back to the night of November 2nd, the election, but more importantly, the good solid work we've done to show substance backed up that symbolism starting on January 3rd, and the work we've done with the legislature, passing a whole series of pieces of legislation with Republicans, Democrats, and at least one independent joining with us to push that forward. That is good news, and I think that's part of a trend. We also saw at the beginning of this week the national bond rating agencies release their reports on the bond rating for the state of Wisconsin, and while other states have seen their bond ratings dropped, and even the threat for the federal government is seeing their bond rating dropped at least by one of those Standards & Poor's. All the bond rating agencies affirmed our bond rating for the state of Wisconsin. And in particular, they highlighted the good work that we're doing to not only balance our budget, but to make structural changes that address the structural deficit and put the state in better position. Today, Bloomberg reported what we've been hearing from individual investors and business owners. Again, the strength of the fact that because of the work we've been doing to tackle our structural problems in part, that has helped more than cut in half the cost of borrowing for the state of Wisconsin. And again, the individuals they highlighted in that story highlighted what we've been saying all along. It's because of the structural changes we're making in state and local government that put us in that position. And then, of course, earlier today, as was announced by the co-chairs of the Joint Finance Committee, the nonpartisan Legislative Fiscal Bureau came out with positive new numbers about their projections for revenues for the remainder of this fiscal year and for the next 2 years that will be a part of the biennial budget process. We think that is exceptionally good news. That is similar to the numbers I was given by the Wisconsin Department of Revenue. And it fits in with all the other things I've talked about because our economists in the Department of Revenue highlighted the fact that in their projections, they see Wisconsin ahead of the curve compared to the rest of the nation. We're one of the leading states when it comes to job growth since the beginning of this year, and we see that as a trend that's going to continue. Overall, collectively, all these things, not just today's announcement, but all these other announcements with the CEOs, with the job numbers, with the new job numbers on the horizon, with the growth ahead of the curve, with the bond rating agencies, all these things collectively I think are some of the best news that we've heard here in the state of Wisconsin, at least since the end of 2008, when really the national and global recession took effect here in the state of Wisconsin. So for that regard, we're obviously pleased, not just with today's announcement, but we're pleased overall. It's part of a trend that shows that we're in a position of putting the people of Wisconsin back to work again, and in turn, that's helping us with other parts of state government. Why is that? Why do we see that trend? Well, it's, I think, two simple reasons. One, we're putting in place a positive change, a positive improvement to the business climate here in the state of Wisconsin. And job creators, particularly small and mid-sized employers, are reacting positively to that. That's why we continue to see good numbers when it comes out of our job estimates and job numbers from the Department of Workforce Development. So overall, we're seeing a positive change when it comes to jobs and the business climate here in the state of Wisconsin. Secondly, we're putting our fiscal house in order. We had to announce through a series of our budget reforms and the biennial budget proposal that's in front of the legislature right now. We had to make some tough choices, but in any number of these different items I referenced, certainly the bond rating agencies, the investors, the job creators out there consistently are noting that the strong actions that we've taken are having a positive impact on the view of Wisconsin and the impact it's having on the economy. So, in light of that, in light of the fact that we have positive revenue numbers coming in, the next obvious question is, what are we going to do with that? Well, I think like any family here in the state of Wisconsin who in the last year or two has found an opportunity, a pleasant opportunity in cases where they found a little extra, maybe not a change in their salary, but a little extra that came up along the way. We're going to do what families have been doing all across Wisconsin. We're going to ultimately pay off our bills. We still have bills that are forthcoming right away. We owe from the past. We owe the state of Minnesota for the reciprocal agreement of nearly $60 million. And we owe from what the state was involved with in the past with the patient compensation fund and the legal action that was taken several years ago and acted on last year. We know we owe more than $200 million plus interest to repay that fund from the actions that were taken several budgets ago. We need to pay off those bills right away and other bills that are on the horizon. In addition, we need to buy down some of our debt. Part of the reason why we're in a good position is because all these entities I referenced recognize that we've tackled our structural deficit, we've balanced our budget, we've moved the state forward, but we need to continue to be strong. For me, it's incredibly important. I look at my two sons, Matt and Alex, and I think for every parent and grandparent in this state, we want to make sure that we fix the problems today so we don't hand off even more difficult decisions to them in the future. What we're doing and what we're going to continue to do is really about making a commitment to the future so they don't face more dire consequences. As I like to say, we're going to focus on the next generation and not just the next election. So taking those two things on, paying off our bills, buying down our debt, and then with the remainder of funds that are available, we want to continue to do what we've been doing over the past month and a half, and that is reaching out to lawmakers in both the Senate and the Assembly, trying to tackle some of the areas of concern that they and others from the public have brought to our attention. We're going to work with them on whatever other dollars might be available after we take on the bills that are currently owed by the state of Wisconsin and finding a way to tackle a portion of that debt, and then finding other ways to make adjustments. And that's something we're going to work not only with the leadership and the co-chairs of the Finance Committee, but ultimately, again, with members of both the Assembly and the Senate on to put things in the right perspective. Overall, this is good news. We've got a lot of work to do. We certainly need to finish off tackling this next biennial budget and do so in a way that maintains a strong positive business climate, a strong positive climate for jobs in the state, and that one that continues to keep our fiscal house in order. And along the way, just as they're debating in the legislature even today, we need to make sure we move forward with job-creating opportunities like the telecom reform, venture capital, and other items that are on the horizon. We've done a lot at the beginning of this year, but we're not done yet. So with that, I'll entertain questions if you've got them.
Governor, does this negate the urgency to pass the collective bargaining concessions, given that this new influx of money will balance the budget this fiscal year?
For the remainder of this year, but for us, really, the reforms we put in place were about balance the budget for the next 2 years. For us to be able to balance the budget and, more importantly, to allow school districts and local governments to be able to balance their budgets and to avoid massive layoffs, to ultimately protect middle-class jobs and protect local property taxpayers, they still need to have those reforms. Those reforms are imperative for the next 2 years, and whether it's ultimately affirmed by the legal process, by the courts acting on this, or if they fail to do so by June, if lawmakers ultimately decide to put that in the budget before they pass the final budget, one way or the other, those need to be in there because they provide the long-term savings that allow us to mitigate any changes in things like school aid and local government aid. So I think that's incredibly important for both state and local government.
Would you be open to not having those concessions take effect this fiscal year?
Well, for us, we're only about a month and a half away from having that the end of the fiscal year. Obviously, fiscal year 2011 ends June 30th. The reason we looked at that originally was in part saying if we're going to enact those as part of the next biennial budget, it made sense as we sought to balance the remainder of what was left in the deficit from 2011 to do that coinciding with those changes for the next biennium. It may very well end up being that if they pass that as part of the biennial budget, the soonest they could take effect would be July 1.
You talked about the collective bargaining savings mitigating cuts to school aids. Why not use some of this overall savings to mitigate cuts to school aids?
Sure. Because long term, we don't want to make the mistake that was made in the past. 2 years ago, the last governor used, and the legislature used one-time money from the federal government via the stimulus to offset deficits in school aid and Medicaid. In the past, they've done similar things with rating funds. That's part of the reason why we face a $3.6 billion deficit right now. For us, the strength, whether it was bond rating agencies, whether it's investors, whether it's job creators, one of the things they've noted is not only a better business climate, but they particularly noticed that we're making structural changes. Not just one-time savings to balance a budget, but structural changes for both state and local government. That's sending a clear message that this is a state that they want to invest in, they want to do business in, they want to grow in. And for us, we've seen it provide long-term savings. Classic example of this with school districts across the state is the Green Bay Press-Gazette, for example, yesterday reported another story of yet another school district, even before our budget reforms are fully put in place via the law. School district after school district are taking advantage of the tools that we're seeking to give and providing savings that ultimately allow them to offset the reductions or changes in state aid. Long term, we need to have those savings so that long term we continue to put more dollars into the classroom. I think that's a benefit for all of us.
So even outside of the discussion of collective bargaining, you wouldn't be willing to use any of this savings to mitigate the cuts you put in your budget in school?
Two things. One, for us, again, we're going to pay down the bills and buy down debt. If there are other things we can work with the legislature on, there's a whole series of things I know the co-chairs talked about, and we're willing to work with them. But again, remember, I've heard at least one lawmaker talk about mitigating the cuts. The fact is we have mitigated the cuts. Overall, we've given local school districts more than enough savings to offset any reductions in state aid collectively across the state of Wisconsin. Those tools need to be there not just for this budget, but they need to be there for the next budget 2 years from now and 4 years from now. So again, the next generation isn't making these tough decisions in the future. For us, we're fortunate now because by giving them those tools, by being able to look at other things to offset so we can not only make sure we care for our children, but also care for our seniors and others who need to be cared for. There are many things we can do to provide a basic safety net, to provide the sort of support we need in this state, and at the same time still promote a healthy economy so we continue to have good numbers like this come up again in the future. We want to continue this trend. We want to make sure that as new revenue estimates come out, each time they come out, the numbers are positive, not negative. 2 years ago, the opposite happened, and those sorts of changes are difficult. And had it not been for the one-time federal stimulus aid, they would have been making, here at the state and school districts and local governments would have been making much more dire decisions than what anybody's been talking about now 2 years ago, but they got a 2-year reprieve because of those federal dollars. To me, the right decision, the right objective is to make sure we avoid those sorts of decisions into the future.
Governor, if you're viewing this new projection, which is built into the base and builds upon itself year after year as a one-time influx of money, how would you define an ongoing revenue source?
No, what I'm saying is in terms of savings, if we were to take money and put that in right now, what we're looking at is savings at both the state and the local level that are built into this budget. If we took this at one point, particularly since about a third of this is just for the remainder of fiscal year 2011. If we built that into the next biennial budget, that's money that's just left over that needed to be used to balance off the remainder of this fiscal year, which of course started last July 1. For us, we need to make long-term sustainable decisions, things that can be built into the base. These revenues would be as long as we continue to have a healthy economy. But we want to make sure we do so in a way that also shows we're making structural changes to encourage that kind of economic growth in the future.
Exactly how much of the money do you want to put toward debt?
Again, that's something we're willing to work with lawmakers on. We've been meeting with lawmakers consistently for the last month and a half. It's not something I'm going to dictate a specific course on. Instead, I want to work with them. I want to work with people across the state and find the best way to balance this off. But again, I use the parallel. Families I've talked to over the last couple of years in these tough economic times, even if they get a little bonus along the way or something extra they find, most of them have told me instead of using it to take on a new expenditure, they've used that to pay off the bills they've had, to buy down some of their debt, so that they're ready as the economy improves. And for many of them, it's people that have taken pay cuts or pay freezes. And in the same way, I think at a time when we're looking at a tough economy and a tough budget, but one that's improving here, and we want to make sure we take care of those bills first and then go beyond that. But in terms of the exact amount, that's something we'll work with lawmakers on.
Governor, Democrats are saying that they get some of the credit for these additional revenues, simply because of stuff they put into the budget a couple of years ago and new investments. How much credit do you think they deserve for any of this new money?
Well, again, if you look at the impact, the bottom line is that the economy has taken off since the start of the year. We've had 24,000 after month of economic challenges in this state. We've really had, even starting in November and December, when we first started talking about the change and the plans we hope to put in place to get the economy turned around. I think those, when you talk about who deserves credit, I think Democrats do deserve credit. The Democrats who voted for our job-creating initiatives in January and February early on this year, because this was a bipartisan effort. Republicans voted for it, a number of Democrats voted for it, and one independent from Manitowoc voted for it. And my hope is on things like telecom reform, venture capital, and other issues, we can continue to have bipartisan support there. So you're not hearing me claim credit on behalf of Republicans. This is something that's good on behalf of the state of Wisconsin.
But as far as credit from the past budget,
I think there are things here and there, some of the job credit components, things that we've expanded on. But certainly, I don't think we should go down the path, as some have talked about in this Capitol, of dramatically raising taxes, because the parallel couldn't be more vivid. You look at the state of Illinois, where earlier this year they had about a 2/3 increase in individual income taxes, where they raised business taxes by just under 50%, claiming that was going to balance their budget. They failed to even take their pension system above 51% funding. We're at 100%. And today they have about an $8 billion deficit. What they saw happen was, instead of getting more revenue through higher taxes, they saw people and employers leaving the state of Illinois. In fact, many of the folks we've seen coming from Rockton or Rockford up to Beloit or Janesville, or from the Chicago area up to places like Kenosha and Racine counties, are because they've had it with what's happening in the state of Illinois. Illinois in the past 5 years has dropped 40 spots, while in 1 year we went up 17 spots. And I think there's a direct correlation to the approach that we're taking in Wisconsin versus the approach they're taking down in Springfield, Illinois. And I think for us, we should take a lesson from that, realize raising taxes at a time when we're getting out of an economic recovery is not the answer. Instead, doing things that stimulate the economy, that truly, not through more spending, but ultimately stimulate the economy by creating a better business climate, particularly for small businesses and mid-sized employers, because that's where our growth is. Out of those 24,000 jobs, significant growth is happening in mid and small-sized businesses. They're the ones that don't pay corporate income taxes. They're overwhelmingly paying individual income taxes. And more importantly, they're putting more people to work, and that's going to help us long term.
Governor, some people are saying that you're taking money from the poorest, most vulnerable people in the state and putting it in the hands of the wealthy, sort of a Robin Hood in reverse. Can you respond to that?
Well, I look at the one of the most regressive taxes out there is the property tax. We're freezing that. We're locking that in. We're keeping property taxes in check like they haven't done really in decades here in the state of Wisconsin. That's going to be incredibly powerful, because the senior citizens living on a fixed income, the young family just starting out with a new mortgage and a new child and daycare cost to pay for, the working family where one or both the spouses have had to take a pay freeze or even a pay cut. All of those individuals will see relief under our budget because of our property tax freezes. And overall, the things we're doing in this budget, ultimately to help the private sector create more jobs, will help put more people to work. The best, though, example in terms of poverty is the fact that we put $1.2 billion of new spending for Medicaid in this budget. That is a program that's targeted for helping low-income individuals when it comes to long-term care and medical assistance. We're providing $1.2 billion of additional new spending in at a time when, not only here in Wisconsin, but across the country, people in other governments are cutting back.
Governor, you support constitutional carry, the idea of allowing people to carry your weapons without having to get a permit or register with the state?
Ultimately, I've said it throughout the campaign, I support a right to carry. I'll certainly be looking at the process. There's a couple different bills up there, and I'd like to see one. We're one of 2 states left that don't have right to carry. None of the states that have passed that in the past have repealed that. And I think in Wisconsin, for us, there's a way to get a good law passed, but I'll have to look at the details as it goes through the legislative process.
What about permits and training?
For us, again, that's part of what we'll look at throughout the process, but I do support a right to carry.
Governor, is there anything in your budget proposal that you would say absolutely off limits in terms of changing in light of this new revenue forecast?
Well, I think whether the estimate had come out today or not, I think the majority in both the Assembly and the Senate are pretty well in line with my overall points of view. I think there are specific provisions here we talked about before where they'd like to make adjustments in recycling, in senior care, and other areas. We've talked about accommodating and being willing to work with them on a compromise on those and any number of other issues. But when it comes to property taxes, I certainly don't want to see a budget that allows property taxes to go up. I think that would be devastating for the middle class in this state, and I want to protect middle class jobs and middle class taxpayers. I certainly think when it comes to overall spending, I don't want to see a budget with more spending, more debt, or more challenges for the state of Wisconsin. But overall, I think we're going to see a budget, again, with or without today's announcements, where we're going to work together with lawmakers to find some adjustments, to find some improvements. That's something when I was county executive, we worked on things like that. Certainly when you have a budget that comes out the beginning of the year and lawmakers act on it towards the middle of the year, there's going to be plenty of adjustments along the way. We're more than happy to make those, and we look forward to working with the legislature on that. Thanks very much for your time.